Bloomberg News has determined the best and worst places to be in the coronavirus era after looking at where the virus has been handled most effectively with the least amount of disruption. Here's what Bloomberg reporters in the top 5 countries have to say about their ability to cope with COVID.
COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
We're now almost a year into the COVID-19 pandemic. As the virus has spread, different governments have faced it differently. Where are the places where the virus is the best contained with the least amount of social and economic disruption? Bloomberg looked at 10 indicators, including cases, fatalities, lockdown strictness, and access to vaccines to figure out which places are the most resilient in the face of COVID-19. Here are the top performers.
Finland's COVID tally so far is much lower than in most countries, with just over 20,000 infected and fewer than 400 fatalities. Tight travel restrictions have helped curb imported cases, and the absence of land border to the most populated areas of the European Union make the country even more remote. The domestic spread of the illness has also been relatively contained without any strict lockdowns, and that's largely thanks to a sparse population with a high level of trust in authorities and tendency to comply with rules, as well as the prevalence of remote working. Social distancing also comes pretty naturally to Finns who are known for needing a large personal space. In the summer, the epidemic was almost extinguished as the Finns headed to summer cottages in the forests and by the lakeside. But the Helsinki region of about 1 million people, which is where I am at the moment, is starting to hit the exponential part of the curve, and restrictions limiting indoor gatherings to under 20 people entered into force on Monday.
With rapid testing and aggressive contact tracing, South Korea was able to contain the virus without a full lockdown. With its past experience with infectious disease like MERS in 2015, it's required by law for people to disclose their personal information, which will be used in government's contact tracing. South Korea has created an electronic entry registration system where you'd have to get a QR code on your phone and scan it so that you can access venues with high risk of transmission such as cafes, restaurants, and cinemas. And just about anywhere you go in Korea, you can easily spot cameras that will take your temperature without you having to touch anything or speak to anyone. Now, with daily cases going above 300 for the 5th day in a row, the government has said that it's going to raise social distancing from Tuesday, which will ban gatherings at high-risk facilities such as nightclubs and karaoke bars. And restaurants are also prohibited from serving customers after 9 p.m. Despite the country facing a resurgence, life goes on in South Korea, and it looks like people have found ways to live with the virus.
Because of Taiwan's complicated relationship with the People's Republic of China, it monitors events on the other side of the Taiwan Strait probably more closely than anywhere else in the world. And so health officials here in Taipei started picking up chatter on Chinese social media of a new infection as early as last December. And so they jumped into action, implementing increasingly restrictive immigration controls, strong quarantine, and also robust contact tracing. And we shouldn't forget that the public has also played their part in this. There's widespread mask wearing here, plus also Taiwan's civic hacker community used data from Taiwan's government-run pharmacies to create apps to allow people to see where they could still purchase face masks and other protective equipment. And so at the early stages of the pandemic, this gave the public a greater sense of agency, that they were able to take an active role in protecting themselves and their families. And so put all of this together and you have comparatively low numbers for Taiwan. So to date, there have been 7 deaths and fewer than 650 infections total since the pandemic began.
Japan is home to 126 million people and the world's oldest population. Nearly a third of its residents are over the age of 65. Considering all that, the country's weathered the coronavirus pandemic quite well in numerical terms. There's been about 130,000 confirmed infections and 2,000 deaths. A state of emergency was enacted in April and May, where some businesses voluntarily shorten their operating hours or close down. However, the government lacks the legal means to enforce a lockdown and instead has been asking people to alter their lifestyles, avoiding risky situations where the virus can spread easily, such as big crowds and unventilated rooms. There's also nearly universal mask wearing. Japan's approach has always been one of living with the virus, accepting that they can't find every case. Instead, the public health system has been set up to track down clusters, these super spreader events where many people are infected, isolating those people and cutting off the chain of transmission there. However, recently there's been another surge in cases, and as winter sets in, officials are worried that people may not be as keen to follow the rules. It's a situation they'll have to keep watching.
New Zealand's strategy, according to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, was to go hard and go early and to eliminate the virus from the community. In practice, this meant the country closed its border to non-residents on March the 19th, and 6 days later it entered a nationwide lockdown. The lockdown was one of the strictest in the world, with all schools and businesses except for essential services closed, but it was also successful. And just over a month later, they were able to lift some of the restrictions. And in June, Ardern was able to announce that there was no active cases in the community and the remaining restrictions were left, except for at the border. In New Zealand's favour is the fact that it's an isolated island nation with a small population. But the biggest risk still remains the border. Everyone returning has to go into managed isolation for 2 weeks. But still, despite this careful management and cost, there's been cases in the community. The worst was in August, when a cluster led to a short lockdown in Auckland. Still, New Zealand has been pretty successful, and in total there's only been 25 deaths. And as you can see, we're leading a relatively normal life here with very few major restrictions in place.
A relatively normal life with very few restrictions in place right there in New Zealand. Look at that, no masks to be seen. Incredible to think of that in 2020. Well, for the full list of the best and worst places to be in the coronavirus era, head on over to Bloomberg.com and check it out. A big thank you to my colleagues around the world for bringing us that report.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.